when you stop and think about it, healthcare has notoriously been behind in any other industry, in any other marketplace that you can think of. Think about automotive or manufacturing. Groceries. I heard someone talking about a grocery store the other day and kind of comparing that to supply chain.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Corey Turner, Senior Director of Healthcare Strategy at Tecsys. That's Tecsys. And Hayes, I'm really excited to talk to Corey because I had a chance to connect with him ahead of time. And I had a general understanding of what a consolidated service center was. But as I started talking to him more and more about it, because we found him on LinkedIn, he's put out some really good content, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the interview. But I didn't realize just how much benefit this can bring to an organization and how topically relevant it is to what's been going on in healthcare recently.
I'd have to agree with you. I mean, obviously, Corey is an expert at this, but the clinical, financial, operational benefits of a consolidated service center, they're impressive. So come on and listen to us today. It'll be great. We're also going to have a little fun at the end.
All right. We're going to be right back after a short break talking about consolidated service centers with Corey Turner.
I'm Hayes Walder.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Corey Turner, Senior Director of Healthcare Strategy at Tecsys, and we're going to be talking about consolidated service centers, a topic we haven't discussed here on Power Supply yet, Corey, and I'm really pleased that you're going to be bringing your expertise to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate the invite, and I look forward to talking about something that I'm passionate for.
So, Corey, as we get started, why don't you talk about your background and, lead into your experience in working in consolidated service centers, which I'm going to refer to as CSCs for the rest of this podcast.
Yeah. So, my healthcare supply chain journey started, right out of high school, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I kind of backed into this career field probably the wrong way. But it ended up being a kind of a good journey for me. Started out on the loading dock here at a local hospital, and just decided that I'm here. Let's learn and let's absorb as much as we possibly can around what I'm doing. And then in the same process, I really enjoyed the fact of making a difference. And I've talked about this in other things, but we often don't talk about it in supply chain enough, but we're making a difference for someone's lives and a patient's life. So that's kind of where my thought was around this. And then it just kind of grew over the years. I went back to college, got my MBA, and then moved up the ranks. And around 2008, I started at Greenville Health System, which is now Prisma Health here in South Carolina, largest IDN in South Carolina, working in their consolidated service center, their CSC, as a supervisor on the floor. And really just, embrace that support function mentality in a healthcare organization. Worked my way up into that organization as director. And then, over the years, I really wanted to be able to support more and do more and talk to more. So after, about 8 years in the CSC at Greenville, I went to work for N4, which is one of the large ERP companies, doing strategy there. really enjoyed the networking, learning from hospital supply chains, learning from some of the big players in the industry. And now I'm with Texas, kind of working in more of a marketing aspect, but in the same token, working as a liaison between our healthcare supply chain customers and our organization, so we can build those applications together instead of in silos.
I love your background of literally starting on the loading dock. I think, that perspective and how that can lead you into understanding the true problems from beginning to end, A to Z, I think is incredibly important. But the most important question I have for you right now, I want to know what, obviously last year was different, right? I mean, we all worked remotely. We had 2020 was all upon us. What, if anything, did you kind of experience new as with a family or anything? What was new for you last year that maybe you got involved in?
Well, Hayes, that's a great question. Coming out of this pandemic, everyone was kind of just shell shocked and really didn't know what to expect, what to do next. So in supply chain in the healthcare world, our focus was strictly around the pandemic and the things that we can do. Well, I'm from the South, as you probably can hear from my accent, and we have a small farm here in South Carolina, and I have 4 children, and so there's never a whole lot of time for anything. But I really got into learning and listening and developing a taste for podcasts. Cliche as it sounds enough being on a podcast today, but developing that thought around, all right, I can get out and I can kind of learn some things from other individuals and really just grow my insight into other areas. I like to listen to music, but podcast was really new for me. So that was one of the things that just helped me kind of escape, the pandemic world for just a few minutes a day.
And the thing about that too is what a reduced human contact time in our lives. And so, all that networking that you might get from a local ARM chapter or just working with colleagues shoulder to shoulder, having that little bit of downtime where you might say to somebody, hey, can I just bounce something off of you? And I know that happened a little bit over the phone, but I also know that we wound up having our schedules filled with conference call after conference call. And some of that downtime that sometimes happens in an office environment just completely went away. And so I'm assuming that podcasting, really filled that void for you. And I could tell you, even for my own benefit, recording all these podcasts during that time really filled a void, for me. And I think a big need in just having to still be able to reach out and learn new things and talk to new people, because that's so critical to our human existence. Something else that you talked to me about as we kind of got ready for this interview was really your personal approach, before we dive into CSC specifically. But I think you used the term like acting as clinicians in the role. Can you tell me what that means to you?
Yeah, over the years, growing up on the loading dock, especially in a hospital, and working, side by side with clinicians, really give me a different understanding of what they actually have to do every day is taking care of those patients. So as I grew my career into a CSC, into a true support function leading a CSC, I often talk to our staff and the people that I worked alongside of is, we have to act as clinicians. We are not clinicians in any way, but without our support, without our encouragement and our support and our doing the job right with a responsibility, they can't do their job, which is taking care of those patients. And that's a priority for supply chain. If it's not your priority in supply chain, we're really doing it for the wrong reasons. Our whole goal is to act as clinicians, as a support function to those clinicians, as an extension of that clinician's arm. So, I really tried to foster that environment in everything that I've done over the years is just how can I be an encourager to clinician, but also how can I be an advocate for those clinicians, not an opponent for those clinicians.
We found you because you posted an article on LinkedIn, really talking about some key areas for healthcare distribution moving forward. And then kind of tagged on the end of that short article was an ebook about 10 reasons why you need a healthcare consolidated service center. So you're creating content and putting resources out there and helping drive that discussion, which is so critical. And I think you made a really good point there about acting as clinicians, because how critical is it for you to engage that audience if you want initiatives, especially one like this, to be successful? I mean, very critical on the messaging side. So before we dive into all of that, can you just tell the audience what a consolidated service center is?
So yeah, a consolidated service center is, years ago, when we started out, we called them a DC, and it was a distribution center. And back then, a distribution center was really just, for lack of a better term, it was a glorified storeroom. It was a big warehouse component that had some automation or some technology to it. But it was a larger place where we could store supplies. When you talk about a consolidated service center, it really is what you're thinking. It is a consolidation of services for the hospital, support functions for a hospital, whether it be IT, whether it be pharmacy. Pharmacy is a big trend in CSCs these days. All of these areas that can be and should be pulled out of a hospital to make room for direct patient care is moving out to a consolidated service center. Now, when you talk about a consolidated service center and the true difference from, say, a DC, it's that complete circle of life, or that complete supply chain is going back and being able to provide data, provide demand, consumption, standardization, data, and analytics back to the clinicians. So working together as a core team in healthcare, supply chain, clinical world, that whole clinically integrated supply chain theme, it's being able to work together and close that loop. And that's what I feel like is a better indication of what a CSC is. It's gathering the support functions in one area and then being able to close that loop in supply chain with the clinicians and patient care and the support functions that we produce. But it's really just, providing those consolidated services in one central location and to provide better support and service for your clinicians.
And a lot of times I think when people think of healthcare and talk about distribution, you've seen the hospitals, they're kind of divided, supply chain into two areas, non-clinical sourcing and clinical sourcing, right? And so does a consolidated service center serve, both clinical and non-clinical, or is it really more successful in the clinical arena?
So when you talk about a consolidated service center, I think as a whole, it is more beneficial for a clinician's side, the clinical world. I was in a discussion with Betty Jo Rocchio, which is a senior VP and chief nursing officer at Mercy, and she won't mind me throwing her name around, but because it was a big day for me that I get to talk to her about the clinical side. But being able to talk about the clinical world being in one lane and the supply chain world being in one lane, how can we converge those lanes into one? How can we get alongside each other and work together? And I think that's the true philosophy and just the thought process around a true consolidated service center supply chain mentality is how can we get together, bringing clinical world, bringing them to the table sooner in any projects that we have, bringing them alongside of us with appropriate data that we may have, working with them. So I think it just lends itself to where we're merging lanes together with the clinical world, so that support kind of comes alongside of it. And I think that there's a lot more quantitative quality by bringing those two lanes together.
Makes a lot of sense. And Corey, I'd ask you, obviously, CSC is going to be pulled away from the campus per se in many cases, right? And so obviously, real estate's cheaper, you get a larger footprint, and you have a lot of built-in advantages there. But because it's away from the clinical staff, how do you actually kind of get them involved? Or is there a method there? It's something you've seen in the past?
Well, I think each area, CSC is going to have to work that kind of as a case by case basis. A lot of times what we would do is we would invite clinicians to our house, so to speak, and we would get together and we would show them what we do. But then the same token, we would also try to take our staff to the clinical world. So we would take them to the hospitals. We'd buy them lunch or whatever, but we would take them to the hospitals and just give them an opportunity to see what they're doing, traveling the roads, through transportation, through logistics, getting to the hospital, walking them through the entire process from the loading dock to the clinical side. It kind of opens their eyes to say, all right, what I'm doing actually does make a difference. It could be my mother, it could be my father or grandparent. So I need to do my job at my best ability to be able to support those clinicians. So what we would do is we would kind of share. We would go to the clinical world and we would invite the clinical world to us. So we're not working in silos. That's the biggest thing, is we try to tear down those silos to work together. So the more we know about each other's processes, the more we know about each other's pains and sufferings and all the things that they have to go through, those hardships, the better off that we can do our job as a support function in supply chain.
So, you're talking about clinicians and supply chain running in parallel, working collaboratively, knocking down the walls between those two lanes. And I am a clinician, and I know sometimes how hard it is. And I think this is where, the struggle is real. Clinicians don't want to give up that control. At the same time, I think there's some clear benefits to this. And we actually had a prior podcast about allowing supply chain, to truly own this process, right? So I'm assuming that by moving it offsite, it kind of makes a more clear divide of ownership, and it helps make that just a little bit more visible. But then also at the same time, there's got to be benefits to the clinicians. What do those look like?
So Justin, coming from the clinical world, you know better than anyone that the last thing a clinician wants to do is run out of something that they can't do their job. They can't perform quality patient care, because that's what they're paid to do. That's what they went to school for. They didn't go to school for, materials. They didn't go to school for supply chain. They went to school to take care of patients. When you don't have the necessary supplies you need to do your job and do it effectively, all eyes are going to come to supply chain. So what we had to do is, when we moved offsite into a building, into the CSC world, we had to prove that. We had to prove that we were up for the job. And it took some time. The clinical world is a hard area to kind of break into. They are focused on patients, and that's where they should be. So as supply chains, we had to come to them with data, with real information that they needed, so they could trust us, they could trust what we were doing, they could trust our passion was to help patients and help take care of them and support them. So that was our whole mantra, was to be able to gather the information, gather the data needed, even if we were offsite, even if we were 12 miles down the road, which we were about 12 miles from the closest hospital campus. We still had to keep that collaboration and that communication open, and then be able to provide them the data that they need so they can trust our systems, they can trust our thought processes and our mentalities around support function as a CSC in order for them to be able to do their job. So we that's the whole point. We can't take away from patient care. We have to support that patient care.
Well, and even as a clinician, the last thing I want to be doing, like you said, is running around looking for supplies. And so if you let me own how those supplies are, and then my counterpart and my other counterpart, we don't necessarily have training and best practices about how to do that correctly. And so it can actually be one of those things where we just keep compounding the issue of having to look for supplies because we're really not the experts in managing that inventory. And what it means is less and less time for me as a clinician to be taking care of the patient, which is the whole reason you get into it to begin with. And so that's where I see just so much benefits, again, to just like having a physical representation of whose job is what. I think conceptually, it just helps people kind of stay in that lane because, as an entrepreneur, I still exhibited those kinds of behaviors as a nurse long before I knew I was an entrepreneur. I was a get it done. I just did whatever needed to be done to complete the process or do the best job. And I think most clinicians think that way too. But when you start overlapping, sometimes you start creating efficiencies as well. And so I really appreciated what you said there. When we talk about those efficiencies though, let's talk through what can be achieved through a CSC. I'm assuming number one, a term that you hear all the time, maybe we can start here, but just standardization and getting control of the data. Am I right about that?
Oh, definitely. When you talk about standardization, there's a lot of metrics out there around that. But a CSE is really just a fundamental approach to support that standardization. We were hitting numbers like 20 to 30% reduction in our suppliers. Just that one little piece alone, there's huge value in it. Some of the other things we were talking about, when we talk about expiration date management, there's how many items on your shelf as a clinician were expiring because of hoarding, because of whatever the reason was. And like you said, to your point earlier, you were there to do a job, and that was patient care. Whatever had to be done, whatever workarounds had to be done, your focus is the patient. And that's what, as a supply chain person, we encourage that. You're to take care of the patient. Let us do the rest. So it wasn't to track expiration. It was to take care of your patient. Just the handling, bringing those points of contact into one location. Inventory management, I have some stats here, but up to 15% reduction in inventory. So 15% of reduction in inventory. When you talk about a hospital system of, 8 to 10 hospitals, being able to reduce your inventory out to a CSC by 10 to 15%, there's a lot of dollars behind that. And one of the things, I can remember when we were putting in a point of use system, we were finding all kind of supplies stashed everywhere. There were sutures in ceiling tiles, and it was everywhere because of the fact that a nurse, a clinician is not going to be caught where they can't take care of their patient. And over the years, they had gotten to where they didn't trust the supply chain because the supply chain wasn't doing what they were supposed to do. So that was my point earlier. We have to change that mentality. We have to change the focus and not have clinicians not believing in us so much that they're stashing sutures and ceiling tiles and other places. It's getting that focus around that. Back orders. We talk about back orders. Being able to have the inventory, the right amount of inventory through demand planning, through other forecasting tools that a CSC's taking advantage of in the industry today, alleviates the clinicians running out of supplies so they can't take care of their patients.
Corey, I think you completely describe, as Justin said, his entrepreneur nurse background, that he was the guy that was, hiding things in ceiling tiles underneath beds. There's no doubt that he is that guy.
I thought I recognized you.
Exactly. So I'm almost wondering if y'all work together because he is that guy. But
if you wonder where all the toothbrushes went, it was me.
He had straws. He had everything. Anything he needed all the time. But with that being said, obviously now there's a big talk about just-in-time delivery as compared to now with some stockpiling. Maybe what role would CSCs play in that? Where do you see about where are we going in the next 12 to 14 months in that?
So I think, coming out of a global pandemic has kind of opened a lot of eyes, especially in the supply chain world. We're talking about disaster preparedness. We're talking about emergency backup plans. We're talking about alleviating stockouts. We're talking about all kind of things that have came out of this. Visibility. I don't know what I have. I don't know where these supplies are going or where it's coming from. So, there's a lot of topics out there, but they all have revolved over the last, year and a half around disaster. What's next? How do I prepare for what's coming? How do I prepare for the next whatever that is in our world? Just-in-time inventory, that is a huge debate right now, actually, because I think that a lot of places rely on that just-in-time inventory, and some of that is because of the fact that they don't have a CSC or they don't have the room for having more inventory levels, larger inventory levels to support. We had some of our customers that, really didn't feel any effects of the global pandemic due to the fact that they had a streamlined, consolidated service center approach. They had that thought process already built into their world, into their healthcare system, and they didn't really see a lot of effect. Obviously, PPEs were a problem for everybody. I don't think anybody can debate that wasn't a problem. But when you talk about the scale of that problem, it's going to be much less when you have this kind of approach already built into your world. So I think there's a lot of debates around just-in-time inventory versus, volume-based inventory, how I can buy more at a lower cost. But I think, no matter what, this global pandemic has really shed light on where supply chain needs to improve, what we need to improve on, how we need to take better care of our clinicians.
Clearly, just in time is kind of being overrun right now with stockpiling, right? And because no one wants to be that guy. I would think the CSC allows a lot more visibility to stock, a lot of, just all the advantages of having it all in one place, being able to send it out to the various facilities. So good answer. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, if I can add just a little bit to that, stockpiling has always been a problem. I've been in supply chain for 20 years and it's always been a problem. What we have to do as supply chain leadership is we have to figure out a way to where we can support our clinicians. And I say that a lot because that's just my mentality is clinical support. How can we support that patient care? So if we have staff, if our organization is just notorious for stockpiling, then we have to wrap our heads around, all right, what are we not doing? What do we need to change? Leveraging technology. Nowadays technology is throughout healthcare, by leaps and bounds of what it used to be. When we talk about demand planning and forecasting, and there's so many things out there that can help us through the stockpiling problems of our supply chain. So, we have to get out of that mantra and that mentality, even through a global pandemic. That's the hard part, is we want to be able to be prepared no matter what and no matter what the situation is. So that's where we resort to that stockpiling. But it's hard not to, we just can't pull the trigger too quick. We got to be able to take a step back, look at this thing as a holistic approach, do what we have to do, be more proactive in our approach rather than that reactive all the time.
Right. You can't just go disrupting it, because that's a whole other project layered on top of business still has to get done every day. Really, really key point about how you approach that. I heard two other themes in there. You mentioned the term emergency preparedness several times, but then you also said technology, and emergency preparedness really ties very closely into the themes around the pandemic, obviously. But then the technology component, and you said there's just so much areas for improvement in supply chain. And I'm assuming that, that's really where we need to take this, right? Is technology has to guide those strategic initiatives, like you just said, without disrupting the daily operations, so that it's effective and that it makes a long lasting impact. It's not like, hey, let's pull a team together and clean this up, and then a year later, we're right back where we were a year ago. Am I right?
Oh, definitely. And, when you stop and think about it, healthcare has notoriously been behind in any other industry, in any other marketplace that you can think of. Think about automotive or manufacturing. Groceries. I heard someone talking about a grocery store the other day and kind of comparing that to supply chain. Basically in a grocery store, you have all of us as consumers are the order pickers, and we're coming in and we're just disrupting things all the time. We grab this, we don't want this, we put it back. So all these other industries have been just light years ahead of healthcare until the past, few years in the introduction of demand planning. I think demand planning is really just taking healthcare in a whole nother world. It's being able to look at the usage demands, seasonality, things that we used to have to do on Excel spreadsheets with inventory control techniques that were archaic, and we were doing algorithms in an Excel spreadsheet trying to figure out how much to order, how to set our par levels. Now the technology is that it's looking at all our usage data and it's telling us and it's prescribing that to us, and we're just now trying to get our heads around that and adopt that mentality, where other industries have been adopting that for years.
Well, they say follow the money. If you want to get something like a Consolidated Service Center together, you better be ready to present the financial benefits of such a strategy. Can you just give us, some key financial benefits that if somebody is like always wanted to do this and just didn't know how to position it to leadership, what are some key things to focus on?
So in a case like that, I would venture to say leading off on the clinical side is a good approach. So when you talk about the clinical world, square footage in a hospital is in high demand. It's high, there's very expensive real estate within a hospital. And for supply chain to be taking up so much space in a hospital, it doesn't make a lot of sense from a clinical side. So that's your first step is, all right, if I pull out my supply chain or all of these functionalities within my supply chain, this is the square footage that opens back up for patient care, whether it's a new MRI machine or whatever the case may be. There's patient involvement that can take place in a hospital without building a new tower, without building those kind of things. So right off the bat, there's an argument to be said about we're going to increase capacity for patient care. The other side on the supply chain world, you're talking about being able to reduce inventory on a nursing unit. So when you talk about a cath lab, being able to reduce inventory in a cath lab, a lot of those items, most of the items in a cath lab is very, very expensive. So pulling that inventory away from a cath lab and putting it into a CSC ultimately affects the bottom line. When you talk about volume-based purchasing, I can order a container shipment load of PPEs. Go back into the emergency preparedness discussion. I can order a container load of PPEs at a fraction of the cost where I can order a pallet load of them. There's just a lot more price point breaks when you talk about volume-based purchasing in a CSC world. But without a CSC, without the room for that, your hands are tied.
Boy, you brought up such a great point just then with the PPE, especially as it relates to the pandemic. How many healthcare organizations, and I think we've talked about this on a prior episode of Power Supply, how many hospitals might have been willing to entertain sourcing direct from overseas and worked through all of the qualifications, but then at the end of the day, to actually get that on a container and get it to the U.S., they didn't have the storage that it takes to get that job done. And so some of those creative ways of sourcing, especially in that emergency situation, were just not available to them. But it sounds to me like that would at least be an option with a CSC stood up for supporting, a mid to large size system.
Absolutely, Justin. We've talked to so many organizations that did not have a CSC prior to pandemic. What happened is in a pandemic is just like for the PPEs, they're struggling to get these PPEs, and they're trying to find them from any location that they possibly can. They get a hold of these large shipments, and then they have no place to put them. So they're renting warehouse space across town at any of these warehouses just to have a place to put this. So then you don't have the technology to know what you have, the visibility, any of that information. So now they're coming and saying, okay, a CSC makes more sense now. So it's almost like that they had to shed some tears, some blood, some equity through this pandemic in order to, kind of see the light, so to speak, and say, all right, so I understand the CSC process now. I understand that there's some benefits to that because I've just lived through this, and now I have 5, warehouses across town full of PPEs, but I don't know what I have. I don't know how to source those. I don't know how to get them, from one place to the other. So they're actually backing into this CSC mentality through just sheer need.
Right. And then it's not strategic. So then you have all the efficiencies and you're not reaping those financial benefits. Great point, Corey. If you're looking at how healthcare needs to be different going into the future, having these options and this flexibility has got to be key. And it's going to take some technology to support as well. Corey, this was a fantastic interview. Do you have anything to add before we wrap up? I'm really glad you came on because it wasn't even till the end that I really saw the vision of how this could be a really key component to the future of supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge undertaking. It's a large project. It is a huge undertaking, but there's so much value out of it when you come out of, especially coming out of a pandemic, especially coming out of, such an emergency case needs that we just lived through over the past year and a half. There's so much value in a CSC, and there's so much just support functions that you can give back to those patients and to the clinicians in that world that you have to have these discussions. Supply chain leaders have to have these discussions now.
That was Corey Turner, Senior Director of Healthcare Strategy at Texas. And what a fantastic interview, Hayes. I mean, there's been just so many conversations about what does healthcare need to look like in the future post-pandemic? What lessons did we learn? What can we do? And, I'm just thinking about that very end of the conversation about the PPE. And just in hearing Corey talk about the flexibility and having all that inventory, just think about, hey, we needed that inventory. We needed that PPE. We shut down these departments and that PPE is out there living. But how do we go get that PPE? How do we redistribute it to the areas of the hospital that need it? How do we move all that around? Having a consolidated service center really allows you to maneuver that really very simply. And, we've heard lots of potential recently in the media that there may be a second wave or some of these variants may present some additional issues. States are talking about potentially reinstituting some of the pandemic requirements. And, who knows? That'll all come to play out. Maybe it'll play out before this podcast even releases. But this conversation is really about having a strategy for the future and being ready for what's to come. And, I love that whole running parallel with clinicians, and the stories about the stockpiling are hilarious.
Absolutely. And what Corey brings to the table, as we said earlier, is that, he's literally done this from the dock to where he is today. If you don't have a consolidated service center, it's going to be very difficult moving forward to be prepared for something like another pandemic or just getting the best prices, the best products at the right time. So absolutely, Corey's invaluable. I'm glad he came on.
Yeah, so let's have some fun here on the podcast. We talked about stockpiling, and Hayes, I'm going to give you some credit here. This is your idea, and it's a great idea. And maybe we'll do a bonus episode or some sort of podcast just dedicated to this. But let's have some fun with the audience. We would love to get your craziest stockpiling stories, and then we'll put them all together. Or, you can really engage with us by posting your stockpiling story in the comments section on the LinkedIn post or the Facebook post. You can also shoot us an email with your story at powersupplypodcast@gmail.com. And we also have a form on the website, which is powersupplymedia.net, where you can send us a message, not only with your stockpiling story, but also if you'd like to get some information on being a guest on a future episode, or if you have a topic that you think we should cover. So again, powersupplypodcast@gmail.com, or visit powersupplymedia.net, fill out the form. And obviously, we love engagement on LinkedIn and our LinkedIn posts. So whatever's convenient for you, throw us your stockpiling stories, and we will stockpile those into some sort of bonus content or episode. So we'd love to have some fun with you all. Thanks for listening to this show and supporting it. Today's was great. A huge thanks to Corey for joining us. And that's going to do it for this show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Power Supply on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. You can access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. And we'd certainly appreciate a rating and review, because your feedback is important to us here at the show. On behalf of Hayes and myself and Gary, who's missing today, Gary, we missed you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.